Welcome to the New Books Network.
Welcome to the New Books Network. I'm your host, Megan Cochran. Today, I welcome Rebecca Haw Allensworth to discuss her new book, The Licensing Racket: How We Decide Who is Allowed to Work and Why It Goes Wrong. Professor Allensworth is the David Daniels Allen Professor of Law at Vanderbilt University, where she is also the Associate Dean for Research. In addition to her work on professional licensing, which is the topic of the book that we'll discuss today, she also studies antitrust and how policy can address competition problems related to tech platforms. Her work has been cited by the U.S. Supreme Court, and she has received the Jerry S. Cohen Memorial Fund Writing Award for groundbreaking antitrust scholarship. Professor Allensworth, let's start with you. What sparked your interest in licensing that led to this book? And specifically, can you give a sense of the scope? And I say that because in the book you say it's bigger than unions and more expensive than sales tax. So how did you get here and what does that mean?
Yeah, I actually became interested in licensing when I was in my first year of being a law professor. My former antitrust professor got in touch with me and said, it's always bothered me that the professions get a free pass under the antitrust laws. These are cartels. We should write a piece about, how that's the case. And so we started looking into it and doing the research, and we thought we had kind of a novel argument that professional licensing boards, because they are made up mostly of members of the profession, and they have to be by statute, they're kind of like cartels. But as we were doing the research, we realized we were not the only ones making this argument. In fact, there was a case that the FTC had brought against the North Carolina Dental Board that made this very argument, saying that they should be subject to antitrust lawsuits. So we wrote that as that case was winding its way through the courts. And then in the end, it went to the Supreme Court. And that opinion, which came down in favor of our perspective, cited our work. So that's how I first got interested in it. And I, kind of after it cited our work, I really ran with that particular football, in part because of how important licensing is. So as you said, it covers more people than unions. It is the most important labor regulatory institution we have, and it adds more to the cost of services than a sales tax. So it's very expensive. It covers a lot of workers, and it's really poorly done.
At the heart of regulation, generally speaking, and licensing, I'm sort of putting in that bucket, and I could be wrong. You can correct me on that. But the idea of it is that we accept a bit more expense and difficulty, both inside the professions and as consumers, as a trade-off for better safety and more reliable quality. But the question you pose is if we're actually getting those things in exchange for that. What did you find?
Well, I think in a lot of cases, the answer to that question is no. And, if anyone tells you it's the same answer for every profession, then they're just not being honest. Because really, when we say, are we getting our bang for our buck? Are we getting the kind of safety and quality effects that we would expect from licensing? The answer is going to be different for every profession. And the answers are somewhat predictable, when it comes to things like hair and maybe alarm system installers. We probably are not getting the quality improvements that we would want, just because those professions are not particularly safety sensitive. On the other hand, when you look at professions where we do want licensing, where we would expect some sort of return on investment there, things like medicine and law, it's also true that we're not getting what we want out of licensing, not because we shouldn't have licensing there, but because those professions also take it too far. They regulate more onerously than benefits the public. So the whole picture is not great, but that doesn't mean we should do away with licensing for all professions.
It's very complicated. One of the things that comes across in the book viscerally is how complicated and specific the research was that you had to do to go into this book. And I want to get to some of the examples that you're a little bit alluding to here. But before that, I'd like to sort of set the picture for our listeners. You mentioned that you interviewed 180 people in the regulation of 28 professions and spent innumerable hours at board meetings and other events. And that's just in one state.
Yeah,
So
Tennessee.
yeah, give us a sense of like, who are these people? What were you looking at? How did that research play into the conclusions that you come to in the book? What did you learn?
Yeah, so when I started the research for the book, I had just done research from my computer. I looked up cases about licensing boards. I looked up economic papers about the effect of licensing. And when I wrote the book, I really wanted to start showing up. I wanted to see what is actually happening at these licensing board meetings, in part because I felt like the scholarship was really focused on the law as it was in the statutes because those are easy to find. It really was not focused on what was happening at the boards. And that's kind of like studying the law without studying courts. So I started going to the board meetings in my home state, which happened to be in my city here in Nashville, expecting to see the boards at work, expecting to see professionals regulating themselves. And that is what I saw. Some of what I saw very much fit with my, what we'll call like an antitrust hypothesis, boards going too far. But a lot of what I saw surprised me because it turns out that boards do go too far when it comes to the regulation of who gets in, what are the requirements for the profession, how will professionals compete, but they don't go nearly far enough when it comes to disciplining their own. So if a provider is really unsafe, likely the board's going to kind of let them slide.
So in the book, I thought, first of all, I just want to say, as a reader of the book, I spent some time on the table of contents, and the way you lay it out is quite nice. And you talk about it at a high level. There's a bargain, and then you talk about who is locked out and who is locked in. So give us a little sense at the high level about what that is, and then let's drive into each of those a little bit, if you don't mind.
Yeah, the bargain is a bargain made between the professions and the public. And this is often how people talk about the professions starting, 100 years ago. The bargain is we will regulate ourselves. This is the profession speaking. We will take the public interest at heart. We will ensure that we have safe and competent providers. And in exchange, you will give us autonomy and you will let us do it essentially on our own. And the licensing board is the epitome of this bargain because they are comprised, as I said, mostly of kind of currently practicing professionals. And yet they have the state imprimatur. They have the power of the state to decide, who are they going to go after for discipline and who can be prosecuted for unlicensed practice. So they have what sociologists have called closure, which means they're able to sort of close the profession to only those that they will let in. So that's the bargain. And then I have this metaphor for how I structure the book: locked in and locked out. So I start with locked out, which is the account of too much regulation. Some of these arguments are pretty familiar, kind of the libertarian narrative about licensing. Too many people can't get into the profession when really they'd be perfectly safe providers and consumers would benefit from more competition. And here I was careful to not only make the kinds of arguments that people have been making about the professions we shouldn't license. I really wanted to talk about how medicine also and law go too far in their regulation and how really tragic that is for American consumers and patients and clients because of the scarcity that it creates. So that's the locked out chapters. And then the locked in chapters are what happens when one of those providers that went astray and managed to make it over the fence of licensure, has a license, but then abuses it. What happens to them in the disciplinary process? And what I learned is that it is extraordinarily difficult to lose your license. It is if you misbehave, you're unlikely to be brought before the board, and even if you are, the board is likely to do something that looks more like slapping the wrist, and that's really pretty perverse when all the red tape and all the regulation that sometimes goes too far, they always say, well, it's for the sake of safety and for the patients. And then when it comes to the other thing, that sort of seems to, when it comes to discipline, that sort of seems to disappear.
Yeah, and you do a really good job of making it clear how that happens and why it happens. One of the interesting things that struck me reading it is you can see these are regular human beings in a really hard situation, being, trying to do the right thing with some very strong competing pressures on coming from different directions. So I'd love to get into that a little bit, but I want to make sure that we cover kind of the basics of the of the of the overall purpose of the book. So maybe you could talk a little bit about what you call the ratchet. This gets to this idea that there's this regulation and it keeps growing. Once licensing is introduced, there's pressure to continue. Can you explain what that means and how it works?
Yeah, so for professionals, more is more when it comes to licensing because it's going to reduce competition, which can mean that you make more money, your lifestyle is better, and it's also going to increase prestige. And when it comes to consumers, it's not always true that more is more. You want to have the right amount of regulation that keeps you safe. But if you have too much, now providers are going to be really scarce. They're going to be expensive. And that can mean that you don't get to see a doctor. You don't get to have a lawyer. So that's bad. But um, professionals regulating themselves don't see that trade-off. To them, it's just sort of like more is more. And when we give licensure regulation over to these boards, which we largely do, the statutes don't say a lot. There's a lot of power that the boards have. Then what we end up with is this ratchet where every few years the board, will say, well, geez, we need to have a higher requirement here. And then maybe they'll lobby the legislature to pass that, or maybe they'll do it through their own regulation. My favorite example of the ratchet is the alcohol and drug abuse counselors, where the practical hours of experience required went from 1,500 to 3,000, and then I went to 6,000, which is actually about the same length as a medical residency. This was a profession that was supposed to increase access to therapy for people struggling with substance abuse. Um, and it just went up and up and up. And the other best example is the hair profession. The barbers and cosmetologists, especially barbers, have been around for over 100 years. And they've had a long time to work that ratchet. And now it takes more classroom hours to be a barber than classroom hours at law school. So that's how the ratchet works.
And it is like stunning when you start to look
Yeah.
at it from that perspective. And then you look at industries that don't have this or practitioners that don't require this. I'm thinking of people who carry guns, people
Hmm.
doing, things that actually do have like direct life and death effects on people. Sometimes don't have this, and yet we have these very high bars.
Yeah,
Uh,
my favorite example of that is like childcare. It's like there's hard to think of something more safety sensitive, more high stakes. And yet the workers at my kids' daycare, they're not licensed. And that doesn't mean they're not regulated. It doesn't mean that they don't have background checks and there aren't rules about, kids sleep on their backs or kids have to be in a high chair when they're being fed so they don't choke. There are other ways to regulate risks. Um, Licensing is just a particularly onerous kind of intervention. And so yeah, I mean, I think that like another good example, I guess, is tattoo artists. So tattoo artists are sort of like cosmetologists in the sense that they're doing something kind of aesthetic on your body. It's permanent, it involves risk of infection, unlike cutting hair. But I would argue that the restrictions we have for tattoo artists are lighter, actually, than what we have for cutting hair. You have to show that you know how to use a machine to clean your instruments, and it's not like it's unregulated, but it's not nearly the kind of classroom hours required for hair.
yeah, there's a real mix of things, and it really does seem to be. Maybe you can answer this question: why are some like this and others are not? What's the sort of deciding factor between them, or is there? Is it just random?
It's kind of random. I think so. The biggest deciding factor is going to be how organized is your profession and how successful are they going to be in lobbying legislatures for this? So I don't have a good answer for why the tattoo artists weren't able to get what the hair professions have. But the other part of the answer when it comes to something like childcare is that it just would be so expensive. Nobody could really get behind an intervention that would make um, childcare and like babysitting even more expensive than it already is. And so, but for things like I said, alarm system installers or auctioneers or court reporters, it is more expensive. And at the end of the day, it all adds up, but it doesn't have that kind of sticker price that's going to cause a legislator to pause. It's just kind of like, whatever, I'll go for this.
So let's go to talk about how this self-regulation works a little bit. Can you explain how it actually works for the individuals? How do the professionals that we're talking about, how do they get on licensing boards? And what is the sort of structure of that part of
So
this?
this was something that I couldn't learn on my computer. Who are the people who serve on these boards and how do they get on there? And what I learned looking at the laws is that they have to be members of the profession. What I learned sitting in on the meetings and getting to know the members is that they're very often not only members of the profession, but really active, sometimes past presidents in their professional association. Associations are organizations designed to advocate for the betterment of the profession and its members. And the reason why board seats often go to these kinds of people is because board work is unpaid, volunteer. You're doing it on top of your busy professional life. Who's going to do that? It's going to be people who already have shown an interest in volunteer work, an interest in kind of getting involved in their profession. And so governors who tend to appoint, usually most boards are set up so that the governor appoints the members. Governors tend to go to associations to say, like, who should we put on this board? Or they tend to defer to recommendations by associations. So that made the problem of self-interest, I think, even stronger, because here you have people who are kind of seasoned advocates for their own profession. I remember one person misspoke and said, called to order the meeting of the professional association instead of the board that she was trying to call to order. And what I heard about this is like, oh, I changed my hat. When I sit on the board, I changed my hat from the Tennessee Nursing Association to the Tennessee Board of Nursing. But that was not what I observed. I think that they try, and I think that most of them were very high integrity and really like at least cared about patient safety in the way that they understood it. But they had these biases, they had these perspectives. And then maybe even worse is not what they were in terms of being professionals, but what they weren't, which is, expert regulators, understanding how government works, understanding that there are bad people in their profession who are going to lie to them. They just had sort of no clue about regulation, about the bad actors in their profession. They really knew their profession, but they didn't really know regulation.
And so as they sit on the board, let's say they're part of an association, their name is out there, they get appointed to a board. Now they're on the board. That doesn't mean that they're not on the professional association anymore. They are
That's right.
maybe there. They're also still practicing.
Yeah.
So they
And
have
that creates problems that I hadn't really thought about. So before I started watching these boards, I thought, yeah, it's a problem that they're practicing because, that gives them the perspective of the profession. And that's true. But even maybe a bigger problem is that the fact that they're practicing means they're so busy. They don't have time for reading all the files, digging deep into these investigations. The other problem is they are so busy with their professional lives that they only have time to meet like once a quarter. I think the medical board meets every 2 months for one day. And so if you have a 3 or 4 day trial against a doctor, which you could in a disciplinary case, that's not a crazy long trial. That's going to take you half a year. So the volunteer nature, the fact that they're busy professionals kind of has two problems. There's the bias, and there's also just the lack of resources.
And then who do they think that they're serving?
So they would tell you that they're serving the public. This is the changing of the hat idea. And I think that is some board members were more self-conscious about the conflicts of interest that they, kind of have when they think about their profession and they think about the public. Others were pretty like cool with it. One said, well, nurses are the people of Tennessee. Like, I'm here to protect the people of Tennessee. nurses are the people of Tennessee. So there was kind of a variety of attitudes about it, but even the people who would have said unequivocally, my role here is to protect the public, they still found ways that, whatever was good for the profession was going to be good for the public. So this is going to be good for the professionals, and that's going to reduce burnout. And if we reduce burnout, then we'll have more, patients will get better care. Sort of these contorted arguments that didn't quite add up to public protection to me.
So let's talk about what can go wrong in some of these, because I think it's like, oh, this is kind of theoretical, like, oh, they're doing that. They're trying their best to protect the public. And it makes sense because people who do are the people who understand it at the greatest depth. There's a certain sort of like surface logic to it. But then when you start to get into some of the examples of what can go wrong, that's when you start to see some of the cracks in the system. And one of the things I wanted to ask about specifically is this idea that licensing boards, with all of these pros and cons and variations in perspective, they have the power of law. And they have quite a bit of power, at least in most states, it seems like. How did they get this power, and how do they use that power?
Well, they got the power from the state itself. So the state legislature creates what we call a practice act that creates licensure, which says, you have to have a state license to do this profession. And it creates a board. And the board will go to, X seats for professionals and a couple seats for public members who are just not professionals. And that board shall, oversee the regulation and shall do X, Y, and Z. And so they got the power delegated from the legislature. Nominally, that makes the board a state agency, although I would argue that it is really not a state agency, but sort of nominally it has that power. And then when it makes a decision or it makes a rule, that has the force of law. So that's how they got the power. I forgot your other question.
Oh,
now.
And so then, okay, so say something goes wrong, like
Yeah.
what do you went to the board.
Yeah.
Is there anywhere after that when something?
So that's a good question. All right. So if the board does something bad, like let's say they take somebody's license for no good reason. This is not something that I saw. I actually saw a lot more of the opposite. You can appeal that decision to within the state courts. I didn't see much of this. The state courts are not particularly active in reviewing board decisions. I think that it's, seen as maybe not a really good use of your litigation time to go take this to the courts, because they're probably going to rubber stamp it. And that's about all there is in the way of review and supervision. So that's definitely a problem. And especially when it comes to disciplinary choices, the state courts are going to be pretty deferential to the boards. So this is a delegation of authority from real state government to the boards. And I think you could say it's like a dereliction of their duties, I think.
Mm-hmm. And so now let's start talking about some of these specific things that kind of go wrong. So where are the pitfalls here? Where do these boards go wrong? What are some of the real you give some really visceral ones in the book, but maybe pick out a couple so our listeners can get a sense of how this can go sideways and where boards can be successful, but also where they fall short.
Well, let me give you one from the locked out chapters, because there's definitely plenty of stories that I think are pretty evocative from the second half, the locked in. But locked out, I want to say a little bit about something like the supervision of nurse practitioners. So medical boards have a tremendous amount of power in terms of deciding what counts as supervision in a state where nurse practitioners must be supervised by a physician, which, by the way, has been shown to decrease the number of nurse practitioners, decrease access to care, and increase the cost of healthcare. Now, this is not stuff we should be messing around with. This is really important to the American economy. It's important to public health. This is not a trivial, alarm system installer problem. This is a problem that really does reduce the public health. And in states where nurse practitioners must be supervised by a doctor, the boards decide what that supervision is. And they can even decide how many nurses you can supervise. So with a stroke of a pen, the licensing board, doctors, can decide how many nurse practitioners there are in the state. A state like Tennessee has a big rural population. We have a really difficult access to care problem. Again, the research shows that more nurse practitioners and broader scope of practice help people, especially in rural communities. So that's something that can go wrong. That's a concrete example. Another one I provide from that part of the book is alcohol and drug abuse counselors. I brought them up earlier. It's so hard to get into that profession that there are only 400 in the whole state. And this is a state with 70,000 people suffering from opioid use disorder alone. That's not even including alcohol use disorder. So that's the ways in which it can go wrong in the over-regulatory department. Under-regulatory, it goes wrong in giving second and third and like even fifth chances to providers who you would have thought that their conduct was beyond the pale. I guess I'll choose here to give an example of a doctor who lost his license for having sex with 11 of his patients. He was an OBGYN in inner city Memphis, and he would have sex with his patients and he would give them prescriptions off book, like didn't keep the right records for drugs with street value. And he said he admitted to all of this. And he told the board that he knew they were selling them on the street. He had a long history of malpractice. He himself struggled with substance use. He used drugs on the job. He had at least 10 peer review cases at the hospital, which is really a lot. So this is a very, very troubled practitioner. And I first met him at his hearing to get his license back, which he did. It was sort of heralded as like a fresh start. He had gone through a lot of addiction treatment, and the board wanted to impose the requirement that he have a chaperone for patient encounters, but wanted to do it in a way where the patients wouldn't be tipped off to that. That was what most of the hearing was about, was how they could enforce this chaperone requirement without patients knowing about it. And that case really shocked me. I just couldn't believe that, the board didn't think we could live with one less doctor, like this doctor. But they didn't. And it basically took me years of trying to understand the boards and watching them and talking to people to understand how that could be.
So help us, I know
Yeah.
we could take us through, like, what are these pressures that are on them that it was so hard for them to they're supposed to be self-regulating. Why is it so hard for them to regulate their own industry? What makes it difficult to both be part of the team and an enforcer of the team?
So I think when it comes to the disciplinary problems, a lot of things are going on. So there's a little bit of identification, like this is another doctor just like me. I don't know how much explanatory power that really has for a case like the one I just described, or some of the more extreme pill mill type cases that I saw. But it has a little bit. Maybe the thinking is like, this person used to be like me. This person started out the same way I did. Went to school just like I did. Then there's this idea of redemption, and I think especially in the medical professions. Doctors and nurses want to see everybody as capable of getting better and, to give them second and third chances. And that's kind of how the whole thing is framed, and how that particular case that I just described was also framed. It was a reward for having, overcome his problems. And then I also think that there's a little bit of more organized professional interests here, like so the professional associations pushing boards to be suspicious of claims against professionals and be credulous of the stories that they tell. And that's kind of what I saw. I think that when board members are confronted with some of the more egregious choices that they make, I think that they can see it then maybe in that moment from my eyes or somebody else's eyes. But internally, there's kind of a way in which it all makes sense.
And so in that,
yeah, go ahead.
no, I was just going to say in that moment they're getting a lot of voices in the room and in their immediate circles that are all inside, right?
That's right. And in almost none of these cases are there actually patients that show up or clients that show up to testify. And so that perspective is not given. And they also can be pretty low information. Like, I don't know that in the case I just described, the board knew that this had been going on for as long as it had. I found out that the investigators for the state knew about this doctor's behavior starting in 2013, and they finally took his license in 2017, which means he practiced for 4 years, while at least part of the state knew this. I don't know that the board knew that. It's sort of a low information, casual, slow process. And boards and their associations aren't really interested in doing anything different.
And I realize that the people on these boards, they are both surrounded by people who have this insider perspective on their profession. Also, they are very limited in their time and scope available to like seek out additional information that isn't provided to them. But is there any way, like, where is the voice of the public in this structurally?
Well, it's not set up very well structurally to hear the voice of the public. So there's two places where the voice of the public could come in. One would be public members. That's actually what they're called. These are the people on the board that are not members of the profession. The problem with using public members to represent the public is that there's almost always fewer of them than the professionals, so they don't have a voting block or anything. And they're not selected for any kind of interest or expertise in the subject. They're kind of usually just somebody that the governor owes a favor to, or someone who's willing to serve. And this isn't somebody who has a vested interest in, for example, patient safety or, access to justice or other things that you might think matter, that would be pushing against this. And they're really told, like, look, you're not the profession within the profession. You don't totally know the norms. Just kind of sit back and take it all in. They're really kind of not told to really stand up, I think, in some circumstances. The other place where the public could come in is via the staff. And I actually saw this happen quite a bit, like the board lawyers or the people who work for the state, because those guys saw the full picture of the profession. They saw the worst of the worst as well, and we're talking about a very small fraction of the profession, but it's there, and that's kind of what regulation is there to deal with. And they would sometimes push back against what the board was doing. But the boards would be like, really very resistant to the idea that anybody from outside their profession could tell them how to do it. So that didn't really totally work.
Mm-hmm. I do want to move and start to talk about some of the things that you mentioned about, like, well, where do we go from here? So we have all these problems. There's this sort of structural situation that has lots of pieces to it. Is there anything you want to cover before we start to go to where you see we could go? Is there anything else?
Yeah. So I want to add a bit to my answer about how is it that boards do this? Like, especially some of the more egregious disciplinary cases. Part of what's going on also is the idea that there's scarcity of providers, and we don't want to waste the investment on this provider. It's very expensive to go to medical school or to law school. And other than this problem, this personal problem the doctor has, they're a good doctor, they're a good lawyer. This is a little bit different from how they view scarcity when they're doing the barriers to entry kind of stuff. But, that was an argument that I think was powerful to the doctors. And this scarcity problem created a really perverse effect. So if they wouldn't take somebody's license, maybe because this guy sees a bunch of patients in a rural community, we don't want to take away that. Or maybe this person sees only 10 care patients, which is our Medicaid program. Well, now we've actually sent the most problematic providers to the population's least able to protect themselves. And this kind of worked on a market level too. So if you had discipline on your history, but it wasn't a license, you still had a license, so it was maybe a reprimand or something, you would fall out of the the best employers, the law firms, the private health insurance, the hospitals, and you would fall down this slippery slope into cash-based medicine, into appointed work as a lawyer or immigration work. Well, that's a real, or prisons, or practicing medicine in prisons. That's a real problem if we're sending the problematic providers to kind of the most vulnerable of American society. And that's, I think, one of the more novel arguments in my book and one of the more surprising findings that I made.
It's really interesting. Um, I do want to move on to where we go from here, but I realized I want to also address one other thing that I forgot to ask you about, so I'm going to do it now. You really focused on Tennessee, and I just want to take a moment and have you talk through a little bit about whether or not you think Tennessee is sort of emblematic of other states or similar to other states or different from other states. Is Can we look at your findings and say it's like that across the country, or is it unique in some way that we need to know about?
I think you can say it's like this across the country. I mean, there are almost 1,800 licensing boards. I have found them all in the statutes. And, that means that there's 1,800 variations on this. And no, they're all not going to be identical. But I think that I know enough about how it works in other states, and I have enough examples from other states. I go to these national meetings of licensing boards. I and interviewed people from almost like half the states. I did not only do Tennessee. Tennessee is where I did the kind of laboratory type work, where I was really there and showing up to the meetings. But I learned a lot about how other licensing boards are structured, and they are all variations on a theme. So I do think that my findings are generalizable to the US. Some states have a few procedures and structures that are a little bit better in some ways. Nobody's doing it right, but if we could put what Vermont is doing together with what California is doing over here, you could see a path to a better way of doing it, which I think we want to talk about now. But yeah, I do think that it's not just Tennessee.
Yeah. Okay. So let's move on to that now. Let's start talking about who's doing something right. What does better look like? And what are some examples of what you think is working that we can learn from?
Well, there are some boards out there that are not dominated by professionals. I think my research showed that there are about 15% of licensing boards are not dominated by professionals. And this is something I think we should do. So, also, I mean, we should just get rid of licensing for a bunch of professions. We license too many things. Um, Licensing should be reserved only when A, there's a real regulatory problem that we need to address. So that would be like a real safety problem, a real information asymmetry, and where regulation of other forms isn't going to work. So I alluded to childcare workers. You can't quite codify what being a wonderful preschool teacher is, but you can codify how you keep a child safe, in terms of the sleeping and the eating habits. And so where we can do that and not professional licensing, we should. However, unlike some of the more libertarian-minded people, I do think that we're going to end up needing licensing, something like what we have in terms of licensing for some professions. I would put medicine, nursing, law in this category. And there we need to overhaul the boards. We need to either get rid of boards, have this done by true governmental actors who have accountability, who are disinterested and have the expertise in regulation, or we need to make the boards comprised differently of, fewer professionals and more not public members exactly, but members that have a perspective and an expertise in the profession, but from a different perspective from the professionals themselves.
Mm-hmm. What might that look like as an example?
Well, it's kind of a thought experiment because it's so different from the way we do it. But I met somebody who was sort of he worked for like an opioid use disorder nonprofit, and he had a real kind of perspective and interest in medical regulation. He was presenting to the medical board, and I interviewed him for the book project, and I asked him, "Hey, would you ever serve on a board if someone asked you to?" And he said, "Absolutely. I have a lot to say about how we regulate physicians and prescribing." So that would be an example. Patient advocates. would be another example of somebody who could serve on a board. Um, and then the way they do it in the UK is that the board members, and especially in the disciplinary side of things, they're all full-time, not full-time, they are part-time, but they're paid. They're like, it's part of their work. And they're given extensive training and they see enough of these cases and it's sort of a part of their profession. And they're not necessarily all professionals from the profession that they're considering. And so I think that works better too, because you've got just more of that experience and expertise with the regulation.
So just to be clear, those are people who have expertise, not necessarily as a working profession in the profession that's being licensed in that example, but they are people who actually have expertise in holding people accountable to the structure of the licensing.
Exactly. So the way they do this in the UK is they have something called they have a tribunal for discipline, and the tribunal draws on this from this big pool of members to make a three-person panel. And the three-person panel is who's going to hear your case. One of them will be a professional from your profession. So if you're a doctor, you're going to get a doctor. Another one will be a lawyer. And the third one can be neither a doctor nor a lawyer. But all three of those people, none of them are going to be full-time working professionals at all. They're going to be mixing, maybe this work is half-time for them, so they're either like semi-retired or they're doing something else, but they've been trained on how to be a board member. They have been given specific guidance about how to handle cases. So it's just a very different type of system.
And how would we get from here to there in the United States?
Well, that's a really good question, and you're going to have a lot of headwinds from the professions. And I think that tribunal that I just described, they don't do any plea agreements. Nothing is done by consent order, which means they have a trial for every physician. What this means, and I said that the members were paid, so this is a lot more expensive. I will admit that this is a much more expensive way of regulating the professions, and we have to somehow get the will to spend this kind of money. On the other hand, I do think a little bit about how you could save money. So you could combine the health professions into one board. Right now, I think that in Tennessee, there's probably something like 20 to 30 health-related boards. You could merge those together. But yeah, at the end of the day, I think that, you're going to have to spend more money on it. You're going to have to fight the professions on it. So we may not be able to have the kind of, let's recreate the English system or the UK system here. Maybe we'll do it a little bit more piecemeal. Changing the membership of the boards would be one way to start.
As we get to the end of our time, unless there's something else you want to do, I want to give you an opportunity to add anything that we haven't covered already. And then I'll ask you to summarize what's the one thing you really want people to take away. But I don't want to cut you off before if there's something else you want to cover that we haven't.
No, I think we've covered it. Yeah.
Okay, great. So then let's maybe you can summarize for our listeners, like, okay, I think you should read this book. Just the examples alone are worth the time of reading it, because it is chock full of really like examples that I was just like, I cannot believe this is real. But what is the one thing that you want them to take away from your book?
I want all patients and clients to know the regulatory system that's supposedly protecting them, if only just so that they understand that you're actually kind of on your own. Like, don't rely on the fact that somebody has a license really for the idea that they are a safe or ethical provider. That's kind of my just like, consumer protection goal for this book. I also want people to try to change the system. I mean, I just talked about how difficult it's going to be, but I think that it can be done. I think it can be done state by state. It can be done by the legislatures. And I think if they realize just how much money they're wasting and human suffering is happening from, the opioid crisis and the cost of healthcare, these are things that bad licensing policy has contributed to. I'm not going to say it's the only reason for these things, but it's a contributing factor. And so I think there should be some political will to fix this problem, even if it means spending some money. Those are the things I want people to get out of the book.
Great. Thank you for doing that. I just want to echo a little bit as a person, as a citizen. If when people talk about red tape, this is what kept coming back to me over and over again. People complain about red tape and regulation. And I think people in their minds, they're thinking about like, oh, the big federal scary government, But I think for most people, most of the time, it's these state and local kind of red tape and complex situations that actually have a sometimes an outsized impact on their own lives and their own sort of costs of doing things in their world. So this is a place where people can make an impact in their own state, on their own lives. So I that came across to me anyway in
I
your
think
book.
that's right. And obviously right now the federal government is coming under a lot of criticism for having too much red tape. But I think you're right. I think that there's more red tape and more problematic red tape at the state level. And part of it is because, you know, every one of these little boards, every one of these little regulations is so small that, it's almost like the seven-headed hydra or whatever. Like it's really hard to come after it in any sort of systematic way. It was hard for me to study it in any kind of systematic way. So, but the good news is, as you said, there are these little things that you can discreetly address and you can tell your legislator about it and you can, care about what this board does. You can go to the meetings just like I did, for every profession except law. Law's got that all figured out. Not going to let people at their meetings.
Not even you, but you're in the
Not
room.
even me. No, I went to the meeting of the licensing entity for the bar. And they were like, "Oh, welcome, Professor Allensworth. We're so glad you came. Thank you for, just they introduced me at the beginning. It was sort of awkward. And then almost immediately they said, and now we'll be going into executive session. Professor Allensworth, if you don't mind leaving the room." And that was all I saw.
Oh my gosh, that's so hilarious.
Yeah.
Closed door session.
Yeah.
Okay, so Professor Ellsworth, what is next for you?
Well, actually, I'm switching gears. I'm going back into antitrust. Antitrust was how I got started in this, and I have been kind of recommitting myself to studying antitrust. We're in a really exciting time right now with competition policy and all these lawsuits against big tech. I've been following those, and so that's what's next for me. I mean, I'm happy to talk about licensing all day long, but I kind of have this. I'm a Gemini, so I have like a split personality, and I've got my licensing stuff and I've got my antitrust stuff, and it just depends on which day you get me.
Well, we will look forward to your next book about antitrust. Tell us now, like, what is the book that you want to recommend to our listeners?
I have two.
Right?
My first one is Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver. I read it because everybody told me I had to read it since I was writing so much about the opioid crisis. There's a lot in my book about the opioid crisis in Tennessee and how licensing is involved. And I just think that book is so beautiful and breathtaking and heartbreaking and really spoke to me. It was very related to my research, but it's also just a portrait of what's happening in my state. It takes place in a different state, but it's right nearby. Wonderful book. And then the other book is a book called Drug Dealer MD by Anna Lemke. This is an academic book, but it's very accessible. And it really tells you why and how doctors started and kept overprescribing. And it's also a heartbreaking book. It is one of the only nonfiction books that has ever made me cry. And when I read that, I was like, I want to write like this. I want to write in a way that brings up emotion in this way. So those are the two books.
Well, thank you so much for those recommendations. We will put those in the show notes, in the episode notes, I should say. If people want to click through, they can find those there. Rebecca Haw Allensworth, thank you so much. It has been a huge pleasure speaking with you today about the licensing racket, how we decide who is allowed to work, and why it goes wrong. Thank you for joining us on the New Books Network.
Thank you for having me. This was a pleasure.